Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2021 Minnesota Book Awards finalist in the competitive novel and short story category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book award are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the novel and short story category through the generosity of College of St. Benedict, St. John's University. My name is Sheila O'Connor, and I am a previous winner of the Minnesota Book Award in 2020 for my novel in Fragments, Facts and Fiction, Evidence of V, and in 2004 for my novel Where No Gods Came. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land on which many of us on this panel recording are zooming in from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state. For this first installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined today by Fredrick Soukup, author of Bliss, published by Regal House Publishing. Kawai Strong Washburn, author of Sharks in the Time of Saviors, published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, part of Macmillan Publishers. And Raki, Kopernik, author of The Things You Left, published by Unsolicited Press. Congratulations to each of you for the Minnesota Book Award finalist nod. I've been in your shoes and I know how exciting it is. So for members of the audience who might be new to your book, could you briefly share a bit about it? How you came to the story or how the story arrived to you?
Sharks in the Time of Saviors is a story of a blue-collar family in Hawaii that is witness to a miracle when the youngest child of the family, there are three siblings in the family, and the youngest child is thrown overboard while they're on a tour, like a boat tour. And the son seems like he's going to drown, but is pulled from the water by sharks and is brought back to the boat and saved by these sharks. And that's sort of the opening of this story. And so as the story goes on, what we start to learn is we start to see the child exhibit these sort of unexplained, you can think of them as powers or abilities. The child seems to be able to commune with animals and have something that appear to be advanced healing abilities. And as the story goes on, we start to see how each family member takes these events and builds their own interpretation of what that means about who this younger child is and what that means for the life of the family. And the story follows this family as a sort of siblings fracture and head out to different parts of the continental United States and how they come back together later in the story. And so that's what the story as a whole is about. It came to me as there was sort of an image that had just popped into my head years ago. I try not to think of writing or art in terms of serendipity or something magic happening, because I think that it can be much less. I don't want to think that it's something that anybody isn't capable of doing. And so talking about it in terms of magic makes it seem like it's something that just happens to you. But this image was one that I carried around for a while, the image of a boy being pulled from the water by sharks, being saved by them. And I don't know exactly where it came from. It stayed in my head for years before I thought about writing a novel about it. And during those years, it just sort of percolated. I asked questions about it while I was out on walks or while I was washing the dishes. And eventually I had enough answers to the questions I was asking about the image that I sat down and wrote the novel, and then I worked on the novel for about 10 years before it hit shelves. So.
And Bliss is a love story set in the Midwest. It's about a young couple whose relationship is complicated by their socioeconomic and racial differences. The main character, Connor, is a white guy from an upper middle class background who forgoes medical school, moves to inner city Chicago, where he meets and falls in love with a woman named Danielle, who's very much committed to her community there. And it basically just explores the two worlds, which he's attempting to navigate. The one back home, which he does not want, and the one in Chicago, where he's living, which he cannot attain for himself. And I mean, the story was sort of born from the time I spent in correctional work in Ramsey County here. I was at the juvenile detention center for a year and a half as a guard, never a resident, but just seeing I guess hearing the stories from the kids there, and the lives that they led, and the difficulties they faced, the challenges. It's just really reinforced for me the privileges I have as a white man in this country. And the story's genesis kind of came from my thinking about those luxuries that I experienced. And so that's I guess I started Bliss around 2015 or so, or finished it around 2016, I think, and found a publisher a year or two later. So I'm very excited to be here and very honored.
My book is called The Things You Left, and I think it's the only one that is not a novel, it's short stories. And I was just thinking about, Kawai, what you said about magic, and because I think about that a lot with writing. You know, you said something about how you ask questions, and I think that that's what that is. That's what the magic of, you know, being creative and doing art is it's not like you wake up and then there's like a magic thing, poof, that happens to you. It's when you engage in that sort of like I like to think about it like the vibration, you know, like you ask the questions and so then the answers come to you, and you have to do that if you want to, you know, create something. Especially, I just wrote a novel too, especially a novel. It's like this epic thing that you have to keep. It's like a relationship. So, so I just wanted to say that it was so interesting how it's like, I think sometimes we're like, oh, you know, I just know I had to work really hard. And I do think you have to work really hard, but I also think there is a piece where it sort of like links itself up, and then there's like an ease, you know, and I feel, so with my book, my short story book, all of the stories happened sort of like that, with this sort of like these moments of ease where there's the general themes are relationships and queerness and sort of like the quirky ways that we engage in the world, and a lot of my inspiration comes from dreams. So there's a lot of magical realism within those stories. Like I'll have a dream and I'll wake up and then I'll be like, oh, that's a story, and then I start writing it, and it sort of just, I can kind of create an arc from that piece, which is like a question answered, you know. It's like I have this vision and I'm like, what is that? And then you sit down to do it, and if you sort of are in it, I mean, it's true that sometimes you have to sort of like push through and force a little bit, but I love that idea of just sort of like sitting down with just a question, or a lot of my stories come from like either dreams or from like a conversation I had or something I read about, and I'm like, what would that be? And then it just sort of like unfolds, lines itself up and unfolds itself, and there it is. So that's kind of, I know that doesn't really explain what my book is about, and there isn't really an arc, but I like to think of it as it really is one person, because a lot of it is, I mean, everything we write comes from us, right? So it's me in a way, but it's not really, I'm not really the character, but it's all these sort of different angles of looking at, you know, character flaws, or just moments of experience in the world.
Thank you. It's so interesting for me to be able to hear each of you talk about these incredible books and how they came to be. In this time of reality TV and what seems like a cultural obsession based on a true story narratives that people seem to adore, I wonder if you could talk a bit about why fiction, your choice to take up your subjects or your concerns in the genre of fiction.
I was thinking about this question a lot yesterday, and I mean, for me, like everything is fiction. Everything feels like fiction. I kind of think of, you know, even like consciousness itself is a process of, at times reflecting on our past and pulling out what is compelling and poignant, and from that developing an identity and projecting that into the future. And I think that, the examples of like reality TV, for instance, it's people like pretending they're not on camera, and with the based on a true story type of narratives. I think even those remind me of fiction so much. They're the way of articulating events in such a way that people who weren't there, didn't see it, can grasp a hold of it and feel it as though they were. I think for me, like, why fiction? Fiction's just like for me the most honest expression of that organization. It's calling it what it is. Like we're constantly telling stories to ourselves and to our friends, and identity itself is a story. So I don't know, that was an interesting question for me, and I was thinking about it so much, it was kind of bothering me, but I don't know, that's just where my mind went.
I love your line, identity itself is a story. It's just a fabulous way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I like that line too. That really sticks. That's a good moment, something to keep. Yeah, I think fiction is a place where we can sort of like show things in a more poetic way, and it can kind of create a more digestible story. I think sometimes the reality TV and the sort of this really happened stories can become sometimes sensationalized, which is kind of fictionalized. And like for me, sometimes I feel it's like I feel guilty to take entertainment off of somebody else's struggle and suffering. And like watching the news, I feel like I really limit that, because I'd much rather read a book about an experience or historical fiction, something that happened in the context of a story. It feels like easier to take in and sort of absorb, and it's much more beautiful. And I think fiction makes the world more beautiful and colorful, and it gives us so much more space to say things the way, that's what I was going to say, Fredrick, that it kind of gives you a way to say something the way that it really is, in a way, like from a personal perspective, from a personal experience. It's so much more sensory, and I think we are very sensory, and so it gives things sort of like juice and flavor.
When I think about why fiction, so my first answer is always because I love it, because I love fiction, because it's good. And at one level, that's enough. Just, I really enjoy fiction, and it brings me joy as a reader to read fiction. And so being part of that sort of celebration or that conversation as a writer, to me, just feels like a natural extension of being in love with books as a reader. But more specifically to the idea of truth, real life events, or things that are based on real life events, can, in my opinion, be constraining as a writer, because you have to deal with the facts as they are in a certain linear relationship to each other. And there's a certain impossibility to truly getting inside the consciousness of people involved if there's some sort of, based on a true story or true story that you're trying to present as objectively as possible, there are certain things that are just constraints that you can't get around, and that you can't, there's certain barriers you'll come up against, right? You can't totally render the thoughts and feelings of a specific individual that's part of this larger event that happened, especially if you don't have the time to like interview them and mind them and all those sorts of things to get to the root of, well, how are you feeling in this exact moment, right? And so I think the bigger emotional truths that we all look for in stories, having those come out organically in a nonfiction or based on a true story type of narrative is much more challenging. And I think that there's a lot of risks that are there in terms of putting words into somebody's mouth and they're like, well, that's not how I really felt, or that's not what I was really experiencing. But when you write in fiction, that all goes away. You have so much more freedom. So there's so much more creative freedom to look at the emotional truth of that moment, because you're not constrained by the facts on the ground, and you can inhabit all these other consciousnesses. And so for me, that's the thing about writing and about reading that is you cannot get from any other art form. You can't get it from a movie, you can't get it from a play or music. And what it is it's the ability to inhabit the consciousness of another person, or even an animal or a tree or all sorts of things, in a way that is like incredibly intimate and allows you to transcend boundaries of experience. And like reading and writing, that's the only art form that can happen, where you can all of a sudden be in the mind of another person or an animal or an individual. And you can't get that, I think, when you're trying to write a based on fact nonfiction account, because there are certain boundaries that you just can't cross. So for me, that's why I love reading fiction. That's why I love writing fiction. And I think that's how it can get at a truth that in some ways can be deeper than what you might get when you're trying to render like a factual account of something.
I always like thinking about the emotional truth of fiction, the thing that fiction is exposing that couldn't be exposed in the same way. It's like peeling back the layers of a story and going for something deeper than the actual thing. So one of the great, a great gift for readers of fiction is the opportunity to form deep connections with characters. In the most memorable fiction, these are complex people we come to know and people we remember far into the future. As a writer, what draws you to a character? And perhaps by way of example, you could talk a bit about one or two characters in your books that had some kind of a magnetic draw for you.
I think with Connor, the main character in Bliss, I didn't really like him. I don't really like him. He bothers me a lot. There are certain things about him I dislike because I think they're things that I do or ways that I think, things that I find out attractive about myself. And that's, there was something therapeutic about working through his ambivalence and his the conflicts that he experienced, and also something magnetic. I was really drawn to him for that. And in terms of, I guess, with Danielle, the woman with whom he falls in love, I just really loved her. I just thought she was so fantastic and such a perfect sort of foil for him, and such a great, for me, it was a great way to challenge him and challenge myself. The story as a whole, what drew me to the characters and the plot was basically just fear. I was afraid of. I knew that it would be an extreme challenge to write a novel that explored sensitive topics, and as a white heterosexual male from St. Paul, I'm basically the among the least marginalized population in the history of marginalization. So there's always this sort of doubt, like, well, what do I know about it? What can I offer? And for me, just developing that theme of a character discovering or the implications of his whiteness and what that means for him and his world. And that to me was really powerful. That drew me to the characters and to the story. And there was just knowing that I needed to give it my best effort and kind of endure like the paranoia that I would do something that would be insensitive or harmful in some way, because that was not my intention at all. So I don't know, there was a lot at play in what drew me to those characters.
Yeah, I think for me, so when you ask the question of, what draws me to a character, going back to what I'd said previously, talking about what it is about fiction that I love, one of the things that I love about character is experiencing a consciousness that stretches my understanding of both myself and humanity in general. So when I encounter a character that I feel like helps me understand the world in a way that I didn't before, those are usually characters I hold on to. And those can be a range of experiences, and they're usually characters that also have very strong contrasts within them. I particularly appreciate characters in which they make really bad mistakes and they have moments where they have like bad behavior or unethical behavior. But you can get to a place where you can understand that. You don't agree with it necessarily and you don't condone it, but you can get to a place where you have a little bit of a better understanding about why people make the decisions they do or why people do the things that they do in a way that makes it, at least for me, like I feel a little bit more connected to other people. There's a little bit more of a sense of understanding myself and other people in a way that maybe allows for a little more forgiveness if I'm thinking about it in the best terms possible. So for me, I think it sounds like some of the same things that Fredrick was working through as he was rendering some of the characters in his novel. Was I had a similar experience with a few of the characters. One of the ones that comes to my mind is Dean, who is the older brother of the three siblings. He's the older brother. He has moments of homophobia, of misogyny. He's the one through which I think the only real act of violence that happens in the novel is he's the perpetrator in that case. And yet you also have these moments where you come to see like this fierce loyalty and love for the rest of his family that comes out in a way that helps you understand him as this really complex character that has a lot of aspects. When I talk about him, I'm like, this is somebody that would have beaten me up in high school. Like when I first started writing him, I was like, well, I want to write a character that would be somebody that I would have a really hard time liking if I met them in real life, but I want to understand them and to see them as a complete individual. And I think that's what I appreciate about fiction writing as well. I also like being able to transcend time and gender and other roles in fiction and sort of explore the boundaries of different characters that are very different than myself. And I appreciate that as a reader as well as a writer. And that's, there's both Malia and Kawai are characters in my novel that are women. They're at different stages in their lives. One of them is older than I am now, and one of them is much younger than I am now. And so it was a challenge to really try and inhabit those characters and find the things about them that were beyond my day-to-day experience, but that I thought still struck at some form of emotional truth. And I appreciate that as a reader as well.
I think it's so interesting that you both talked about like characters that you don't like and creating characters of people that are flawed. I definitely have the same thing. I think that's a very like consistent theme in writing and music, for me, in the way that it's sort of like self-reflective. It's like I love kind of taking a piece of myself or a flaw that I have that or even just like I felt this once and then making a whole character out of it. Like I have a story about this woman who just looks out her window at the same time every day and sees the same person passing and sort of is like having this dialogue with herself and trying to connect with this person. And at one point they make eye contact and then she feels weird about it. And it's sort of this like obsessive, like I think a lot of my characters have a little bit of an obsessive quality, like something I think about and then it becomes the whole the whole thing. And I think it's very hard to write a character that's sort of like perfect, or the idea of like, what a wonderful person all the time, because that's not a real thing. Nobody's like that. And right. And I think we, as much as we create, you know, especially in fiction, we create characters and we create scenarios. I think, I mean, I can't speak for other people, but I really feel like for myself, even when it's so far from who I am, it's something about myself, or it's some form of a way a feeling I've had, or maybe somebody else I've interacted with, or a collection of people turned into one character that that reflects something back to me, even if it's not a character based on myself. You know, I think in this way, like we all sort of are living in our own, we're all the center of our own bubble, like we're all our sun and moon little universe, right? And then everything that we shoot out is somehow still connected, and we create this sort of web all the time. And I think that's what's so fun about it, and what's so interesting too, going back to why fiction, because I think it gives me like such an interesting way to explore just my own experience of being alive. And then I also, you know, like I want to show people, you know, for me as a queer writer, a queer woman writer, I want to really normalize what queer relationships are without it being like a coming out story, or a, you know, or a hate crime, or I just want it to be like, here's these two queers having a hard time in their relationship, but it has nothing to do with them being queer. They happen to be. And, you know, I think about that a lot, but it's not really, it's more underlying, because I'm just sort of living my experience of life. And then that's what, like, again, that sort of channeled, like, that's what ends up coming out. You know, I think there's like a level of consciousness, and then there's a level of just sort of like flow, that what comes out and what characters are created, you know, just when we're sort of in the rhythm of writing and the little pieces of a story. So yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, I just was thinking about, you know, writing about what you were saying, Raki, about writing about like really great people. Like people are always telling me to write stories about my wife because she's so wonderful and interesting, and it's like, yes, but it's not really like a lot of like inherent conflict there in like the lives of the wonderful. They're not always the most like interesting as characters, as people, yes, but as characters, there's they don't always work out. So I was just gonna add that. And my wife is wonderful, by the way.
So I'm going to turn now to asking a couple of questions about the execution and the craft of your individual books. So we have a chance to talk about that. And my first question is for Raki. In the things you left, you have 37 fabulous stories. Themes and tone vary greatly. Did you set out to create a wide-ranging collection in this way, or did that come about organically? How long did it take you to write from the first to the last? And were there gaps when you were writing and doing other things? And how long it took you to write is always of interest to people, but it's especially interesting, I think, with a short story collection where it's almost like a collage, or pieces that have had a life long before they came into company with one another.
Yeah, I think that is very true, that it's short stories. Writing short stories is a really different process than writing a novel or a memoir. But I would say it was pretty organic. I wish I could, people always ask how long it took you to write something, and I really don't know. I feel like I had this book for a really long time, and it was like, you know, it happened in pieces, and I was working on always other things in the process. But that said, I'm never working on just one thing. I always have a few projects, because, you know, there's those moments when you go to work on it and you're like, this is garbage. And then you have to go do something else. And then you come back to it and you're like, I'm a genius. Now I can do it, and on the same thing, it's like so much depends on what the personal experience I'm having in life is. So I don't know how long it took me to write it, start to finish.
So Fredrick, in Bliss, we become privy to the main character's struggle for identity and authenticity. However, this is not so much through inner monologue as Connor's dialogue with other characters and his actions. What drove you to lean as you did on the third person narrative? Did you consider constructing the story in other ways, including as a first person narrative?
I didn't consider doing it in first for a few reasons. The first was that I thought that would maybe complicate things a little bit, just because of the nature of his thinking. He's young. He's kind of sporadic. His motivations are a bit unclear, even to himself, outside of his love for Danielle early on in the work. And so I thought it was a little bit that it would be better served to do it in third person for that reason. The other reason was that I maybe just didn't feel equipped to do that. I just, I was a bit younger and I thought, well, I don't know if I could maybe pull that off, but I'm happy with where it came out. And if I wrote it again, I think I would do it in third still. But I do think one advantage of writing in third person is that you are, while you're asking a lot of the reader, or perhaps more than you would by writing in that way, they have to really look for clues sometimes and some symbolism. I just felt like as a reader that I find that process a bit more rewarding. First person can be done in like extraordinary ways, and I'm sure that if I were a better writer, I could have done it in first person and still had that compelling quality to it that I hope is present in its current form. But I thought that third person worked for the style. I don't know.
Thank you. And Kawai, you're a vocal climate activist, and those views come through in Sharks in the Time of Saviors. How is climate change manifesting itself in Hawaii in ways that folks in Minnesota cannot see firsthand? Did you make intentional, conscious choices about including references to the area's environmental challenges, or did that happen organically?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm glad that for some readers, it sounds like the idea of the relationship between people and the land is something that came through in the novel, because it was certainly one of the themes that seemed to me was one of the more important things in the novel as I went through the revision process and really started trying to focus what the major themes of the work were. And so I think at first I started from a position of anti-colonialism. I won't spend too much time talking about it here just because it's a long story, but for readers that are unfamiliar with it, Hawaii was once a sovereign nation. It was its own country. It was its own completely self-governed entity until it was annexed illegally by the United States and became the 50th state at a later date after it had been annexed. And so when I first started writing, that was one of the things that I was writing toward was a narrative that took that as one of its central concerns. And in doing so, I think that you naturally come to a place where you also start to realize that the relationship that the people of Hawaii had to the land in the past was radically altered because of annexation and because of colonialism. And so when you start at a place of colonialism and start working backwards to the implications of it, you naturally come to the conclusion of looking at the relationship between the people and the land. Also because it was such a sacred relationship for the people of the islands. That's what the story ended up being about. And so that's sort of, those things just show up naturally. Now, to take that a step farther, I would also say that colonialism is a product of of supremacy. And if you go from supremacy to colonialism and you continue on that path, climate change is just a symptom of that. And so when we're talking about the islands and climate change that we're seeing now, what some of those impacts are, and that most people in Minnesota might not be familiar with. One of them is the impact it's been having on the reefs. So reef bleaching, which is a side effect of the carbon dioxide that's being absorbed at an accelerating rate by our oceans, leads to like the death of a reef. And so all the fish and everything there that lives off of a reef ecosystem is obliterated when the reef goes through a bleaching event. Those have been happening at increasing frequency and increasing severity, both in Hawaii itself, but in the greater Pacific. So you'll see this, there's a lot of articles out there about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and how it's just been just so heavily impacted by warming waters and the level of bleaching that has occurred and how much of the reef has already died and will probably continue to die even if we were to cut our emissions to zero right now. The feedback effect and the long-term effects would continue on the reef for quite some time. Those same things are happening in Hawaii. So that's one of the things I think a lot of people aren't familiar with that's happening right now and will probably sadly continue to happen for the foreseeable future. You also see the increase in storm severity. And while you can't point to any one specific hurricane or any one specific weather event and say that is caused by climate change or by CO2 emissions, you can say events like this will incur with increasing frequency and increasing severity as the planet warms. And so you do see more storms, you see reefs bleaching, there's, rises in sea levels and the sort of the effects those have both on coastal communities as well as the erosion that occurs that then accelerates. And so those are some of the things that the book talks about sort of tangentially, but I'm glad that a lot of readers have had a chance to see the connection between those two things.
Thank you. That led beautifully into what my final question is for you all, which is on the subject of place. What does it mean to you to be a writer in this time and place, however you might define that?
Yeah, I think, I think about this idea a lot of, people always talk about, especially now we're in this time of the pandemic, like it's the craziest it's ever been, or we've never been alive in a time like this. And I think a lot about how I think every generation feels like that, and I think about the stories of my parents as immigrants coming to this country and the things that they went through. My grandmother was in a prison camp, thinking about, I think about that in relation to, that the era, World War II era a lot, like what were they feeling? What was it like for them to be alive in that time? And in this way, so in this way, as whoever you are, as an artist, a writer, whatever, and in this way, I think right now it's such an amazing gift because we can do things like that. We can have these things happening and then we can still connect, like having the internet and having just sort of like accessibility in general. As we move in time, things become more accessible, art becomes more accessible. I think it's hard in a way to be a writer because there's so much and it's sort of like saturated, and as the duality always is, it's also amazing to be a writer right now because there's so many small presses, there's so many people doing so many creative things, and there's so many places to connect. There's such a huge web of finding that connection and finding community around it. I think it used to be that being a writer, I just was talking about this with somebody, a friend of mine I ran into who is an older man in his maybe 70s. And he was like, how's the writing going? Have you just been drinking a ton of whiskey and like sitting by yourself? And I was like, well, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I love whiskey. Sure, sometimes. But that's not really what a writer is anymore. And he was like, well, I always think of Hemingway. I'm like, there's so much more nuance and diversity now. There always has been, but now we actually get to have more voice as people of color, as women, as queers, as trans people, there's so much more space, I think, in a way, just to see and to hear and to acknowledge. And so, I think it's kind of a beautiful, magical time to be a writer, in that we can really sort of reach each other more easily, and it's hard, and it's always, I think everybody's like, what a time to be alive, and also what a time to be alive, so.
I guess I could follow up on that. So first of all, I think that that's a beautiful sentiment and something I certainly agree with. I'm always heartened when I can see the expansion of a space. And so when you go back to talking about Hemingway at one point as being everybody's idea of what it meant to be a writer and how we've come so far from that. Thank God, right? I'm so glad we're getting to a place where that as the prototypical writer is gone as an idea. That's for me is a wonderful thing about being around right now. And as a reader, having all of these voices that have gotten more support than they would have gotten in the past, all these people that were locked out of the publishing institutions previously that are now present and we can read their voices, and all the wonderful independent publishers that have thrived in this space and that have found a place to deliver on this sort of fiction that I think a while ago would have been much harder to bring to market. Not even fiction, we're talking poetry, narrative nonfiction, all the wonderful types of writing that are out in the world now. And that, to me, that all feels like an expansion, which is wonderful. I always like to be in the middle of an expansion because even though it can sometimes be destabilizing and it can be scary because it's can be very unknown and you can feel like you can't find your footing, I think that in the end, it ends up making for a much richer and more powerful space. And so I love that about writing and that the fact that it's expanding constantly. I think that the thing for me that's a challenge or that I have found difficult is that I will say, and this is probably like a hot take, because I don't even know, but the whole idea of the internet and the way it's changed the way people relate and the way they seek out information and talk to people about information and the way we absorb it, to me, has been really troubling. It's been hard to try and engage thoughtfully on things like social media or to be in that space, even though it's a place where it feels like a lot of the conversation gets driven to or where it starts. That for me has been really hard as a writer because I don't think it's a place that makes much space for nuance or deep and slow thinking. And that I find reflects in other media circles. So I feel like both the cable news cycle and even newspapers, now that they're online, are driven more by trying to catch people's attention and to have like a really fast response to something that's happening. And I don't feel like we have as much space to slow down and think deeply and to think slowly. And so when major events happen, I think that the narrative about them can collapse really quickly because everybody's like fast emotional reaction to the thing really quickly collapses the discussion so that things end up on like one side or the other really quickly. And so it's like you can almost know before an event, as an event occurs, you already know what the spin is going to be for this particular perspective or that one. And there's no space to discuss it. You just take a side and that's it. And if you don't, then you're immediately under attack. And like the discussion just deteriorates in a way that I find really troubling and hard to deal with. And so for me, I'm trying to find space as a reader and just a person that's existing that rejects that space. I don't really like it. I don't feel comfortable there. And so I've found challenge as a writer, even in people's response to my work, right? I've seen people have like found me on the internet and things like that. And their response to my work is sometimes I can see driven by that same sort of thinking. It has less to do with the sort of taking the time and the space to think deeply and to discuss it with people in a way that is unchained from any ideas of like, right or wrong or left or right or red or blue or all the different categories people put themselves into so that they can argue about things. I find that some people come to the work already with a lot of predisposition that is hard to overcome because a lot of our discussions now encourage taking sides really quickly and collapsing into your identity and fighting with other people before you even have a chance to consider things. So I found that really challenging as a writer and even just a person existing in the world today. But I will also agree with the things that Raki said that I love about writing now and being a writer now. It feels very expansive in a lot of ways as well.
Well, it was a lot easier to go first on these questions. Yeah, I agree with so much that you guys have said. I do think, Kawhi, with fiction, it's an opportunity to have subtle and nuanced conversations with readers. They're having a dialogue with you as a writer, and I think there's something really powerful about that, and that I agree that our culture is really starved for those sorts of interactions and that depth and consideration. And you don't always have all the answers right away. You can't um, you can't, there's no like spark notes for life, man. You gotta dig deep sometimes. And so I do think that creates an opportunity for fiction and fiction writers to create create openings for those types of conversations. um, I in terms of the talk of Hemingway, etc., I definitely agree with you guys. I think that it's really cool that we get so many different stories from so many different perspectives, and perspectives that have been um, uh, pushed to the side for so much of our history here in publishing. And one of the reasons that I like hearing about different stories. I like experiencing different things. I also like that it makes the job so much harder. Like, yes, there are a lot of independent presses, and there are places to go with your fiction, but man, it's like really hard to get. It's hard to get published because there's so many other voices that are able to be heard now, and that's a great thing because um, if I had been published, right out of college 10 years ago, um, I think I would have felt great about it. But looking back, I've been like, man, this isn't any good. I needed to get better. I needed to improve. And so that I think that competition is something that, it excites me, and it brings out the best in my work, I feel. So I really do like that. Um, Getting back to the initial question too about writing in this time and place, I think I've just been setting things before like 2015 for a while because I'm still sort of digesting like things that have happened. Um, like I don't know, as a white guy, it's like in 2016 happened. You're like, wow, we had a lot of problems here, don't we? I had no idea. I mean, um, there's just so much ignorance, and that comes out in Bliss too. And like ignorance is bliss. For me, is kind of one of the connotations um, that resonates with the work. But really, I in the COVID era, I'm like riding it out. I'm waiting to figure out like how are we going to see ourselves through this? What would life be like afterwards? Because I'm not really in the business of prognostication. I'm kind of looking back. I'm kind of looking about the way things are, and there's just a lot of uncertainty, I guess, for me about where we are and where we're going and how we're gonna get through to the end. But I'm certainly more, as many people are, more hopeful now about seeing it through to the end of COVID. I think that'll be great. But in closing, yeah, I think it's a great time to be a writer, man. Like, there's just um, so many unique stories that are being told, and every time I look, you go for a lot of these publishers, they're asking for it, they're demanding it, and it's a wonderful thing.
Thank you. This was just a really incredibly moving conversation for me to be a part of today. I'm honored to have been here and to be able to listen to each of you. I want to thank our tremendous novel and short story category finalists, and to all of you watching for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Thursday, April 29th. That's the evening that the winner in this literary category and the 8 others are finally revealed. It will be entirely online. Attendance is free, but registration is required. Visit thefriends.org MNBA to reserve your spot. And gratitude to you all, to the finalists, and to the people who tuned in to be a part of this.